The morning I closed the valve on my own land, Marla Whitcomb stood outside my gate, pointing at me like she had caught a criminal in the act. 10 minutes later, 3 patrol cars came tearing up the gravel road. She screamed that I had poisoned the neighborhood water supply and demanded the deputies put me in handcuffs in front of my own fence line. Marla had no idea I had spent 2 weeks quietly checking every pipe on my property before I ever touched that valve. She had no idea the line I shut off did not belong to her homeowners association at all. It belonged to me, and it ran straight from my well to the one place in Silvercrest Estates she never wanted anyone looking. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you what happened that morning. My name is Nolan Rourke, and I am not a man who raises his voice. I spent 14 years as a licensed water systems engineer for a mid-sized city before I came home to run the ranch my grandfather built. And in all those years, I learned that the loudest person in a dispute is rarely the one telling the truth. I had watched contractors lie about pressure readings and watched city officials lie about budget shortfalls, and I had learned to let paperwork do the talking instead of my temper. That habit would matter more than I ever expected once. Marla Whitcomb decided I was the enemy of her perfect little community. Red Hollow Ranch had been in my family for over 70 years, long before anyone poured a single foundation for Silvercrest Estates. The development went up 12 years ago on what used to be open pasture, and from the day the first bulldozer rolled through, Marla treated my fence line like an insult to her property values. She complained about the smell of my cattle. She sent letters demanding I repaint my barn in an approved color scheme, as if a barn built before her subdivision existed owed her anything. She told anyone who would listen that a single man living alone on a working ranch could not possibly understand what she called the standards of a civilized community, and she said it in a tone that made clear she meant every word as an insult to my character. I never fought back publicly, because arguing with Marla Whitcomb in front of an audience was exactly what she wanted. She thrived on being watched, on being the woman with the microphone at every meeting, the one who decided whose hedges were too tall and whose trucks were parked in the wrong spot. She once sent me a certified letter claiming my cattle trailer, parked on my own gravel drive, violated an ordinance that applied only to paved streets inside the subdivision, a full quarter-mile from where my trailer actually sat. Another time, she stood at the edge of my property with 2 other board members, snapping photographs of my hay bales as though she were building a file for a courtroom that would never exist. I simply mailed back copies of my deed and the county boundary survey every time she tried to claim jurisdiction over my land, and I let the documents speak where I stayed silent. What I did not expect was that somewhere behind all that bluster, Marla was hiding something far more serious than a dispute over paint colors, and it would take a rise in my electric bill to lead me straight to it. It started small, the way these things always do. My well pump began running at hours it had no business running, long after every trough on the ranch was full and every faucet in my house was shut. My electric bill for the pump climbed nearly 40% over 3 months, and I could not account for where that extra water was going. I checked every line I knew about, every valve my father had ever installed, and everything came back normal. The only explanation left was a line I did not know about. Buried somewhere underground, I thought I understood completely. I remembered, somewhere in the back of my mind, that my father had once let the original developer tap a temporary line off our well during construction, back when Silvercrest did not have its own water service running yet. That agreement had a 5-year limit written into it, plain as day, and it had expired 8 years earlier. Nobody had ever come back to remove the tap, as far as I knew, and nobody had ever asked permission to keep using it. I started to wonder if an old, forgotten agreement was still quietly draining my well, long after it should have been sealed shut. So I did what any engineer would do. I went looking for the pipe with my own 2 hands, Working from an old hand-drawn map my father kept in a metal box in the barn office. Near the eastern fence line, exactly where the map hinted something might be buried, I found a 6-inch line sunk deep in the clay, running straight toward the boundary of Silver Crest Estates. I checked the county water records that same afternoon, and officially, that pipe did not exist. No permit, no easement, no inspection report, nothing. Whatever it was, it had been built and buried in silence. I did not shut it off right away. I wanted to know exactly where the water was going and how long this had been happening, because a man who acts on a hunch instead of evidence usually ends up losing the argument even when he is right. I installed a certified flow meter in the access pit and a small weatherproof camera aimed at the junction box. Then I let it run for 2 weeks and watched the numbers climb. What I found chilled me more than the theft itself ever could, because the water was not just feeding the clubhouse fountain or the community pool the way I first assumed. The data showed steady, heavy draws every single day, funneled toward the Homeowners Association clubhouse, the decorative lake out front, and the community pool behind it. But there was a smaller branch too, one that split off from the main line and ran under a private access road straight toward Marla Whitcomb's own house. I sat with that information for a long moment before I understood what it meant. The woman who called me an ignorant rancher unfit to understand her civilized community was quietly running her own greenhouse and koi pond off water she had never paid a cent for, pulled straight from my land. There was a second problem buried in that discovery, one that worried me even more than the theft. The unpermitted line had no certified backflow preventer anywhere along its length, which meant chemically treated pool water or fertilizer runoff from that landscaping could, under the wrong pressure conditions, flow backwards straight into my well. That was not a property dispute anymore. That was a public health risk sitting less than 50 feet from where my cattle drank every single day, and it was a risk nobody but me seemed to know existed. I stood in that access pit for a long while after I first understood what I was looking at, running my flashlight along the seams of the pipe, checking the fittings the way I once checked municipal lines for a living. The workmanship was decent, better than a hobbyist could manage, which told me whoever installed it had hired a real contractor and paid real money to keep it quiet. That detail bothered me almost as much as the theft itself, because sloppy work suggests carelessness, while careful work suggests intention. Someone had planned this, budgeted for it, and made a deliberate choice to bury it rather than ask. I called the County Water Authority and scheduled a formal inspection with a woman named Tessa Langford, a resource inspector known around the county for being meticulous to a fault. She told me over the phone that I should not physically damage the line before she arrived. But she confirmed something important, that as the owner of the well and the valve located entirely on my own property, I had every legal right to shut it down if I believed there was a genuine contamination risk. I sent a formal written notice to the Silver Crest Estates Board that same week, giving them 10 business days to produce any permit authorizing use of my well water. Marla's written response arrived 4 days later, dismissive in a way that told me she had not taken the letter seriously at all. She wrote that a man with my background had no standing to question infrastructure decisions made by trained professionals, and she referred to my brand new certified flow meter as a toy some attention-seeking farmer had bought to make himself feel important. I filed her letter away with everything else and kept my mouth shut because I had learned that people who underestimate you tend to keep making mistakes right up until the moment the evidence catches up with them. 3 nights later, my camera caught something that changed everything. A contractor in an unmarked truck opened the access pit after dark and began working to remove my flow meter, and standing right beside him, directing every move with a flashlight in her hand, was Marla Whitcomb herself. The audio was faint but clear enough. She told the contractor she did not want me knowing exactly how much water the association was pulling, and she said it without a hint of hesitation, as if she had done this kind of thing many times before and never once worried about being caught. I copied that footage onto 3 separate storage devices that same night before I did anything else, because evidence that exists in only one place is evidence that can disappear. I sent a copy to a water rights attorney named Claire Dandor the next morning, a woman with a reputation for taking apart homeowners associations that overstepped their authority. Claire watched the footage twice and told me, in her characteristically clipped way, that Marla had just handed me the single most damaging piece of evidence in the entire case without even realizing it. The following morning, my pressure sensors flagged something even more alarming. Readings near the boundary junction suggested treated pool water was pushing backward into the shared line under certain pressure conditions, exactly the contamination risk I had feared from the start. With Tessa's inspection only days away and an actual health hazard now confirmed rather than theoretical, I made the decision to shut the valve myself. I posted 3 signs at the access point, plain black lettering on whiteboard, stating clearly that this was a private system closed for a safety inspection and that no one was authorized to reopen it. Less than 5 minutes after I turned that valve, the ornamental fountain outside the Silvercrest clubhouse went silent. 10 minutes after that, Marla's SUV came flying up my gravel drive, gravel spraying from under her tires. She did not ask me a single question about what had happened or why. She simply ordered the contractor riding with her to cut the padlock on my gate, as though my property line meant nothing at all once her landscaping was inconvenienced. I warned her calmly that she was trespassing on private land, and that every camera on my property was recording everything happening in real time. She did not care. She told me a man who spent his days in mud and manure had no business deciding who got water for houses worth well over $1 million, and she said it loud enough that 2 of her own neighbors, walking by, stopped to stare. I explained, as evenly as I could manage, that every home in Silvercrest was still connected to the municipal water system and had never lost a single drop of drinking water. Only the unpermitted landscaping line, the one nobody could produce a permit for, had gone dry. Marla was not interested in that distinction. She pulled out her phone right there in my driveway and dialed 911, and I listened as she told the dispatcher a story that had almost nothing to do with what had actually happened. She said an armed man was tampering with the neighborhood's drinking water. She said hundreds of families were at risk of contamination within the hour. She said I was actively threatening the entire community, and every word of it was designed to make the person on the other end of that call believe lives were in immediate danger. I put down my wrench and my pressure gauge in plain sight and kept both hands where the responding officers could see them the moment they arrived, because I had learned a long time ago that panic only makes an innocent man look guilty. 3 patrol cars pulled up within minutes, lights flashing across my own fence posts, and Marla stood in front of the small crowd that had gathered and demanded they handcuff me before I, in her words, destroyed anything else. I did not argue with her in that moment. I simply waited, because I already knew the paperwork in my truck told a very different story than the one coming out of her mouth. The responding deputy introduced himself as Grant Hollis, a calm, careful man who kept his body camera running the entire time without being asked. He looked between Marla and me and asked the only question that actually mattered: why I had shut off a line that Marla insisted belonged entirely to the homeowners association. I told him the truth in as few words as possible. I had shut a valve located more than 30 feet inside my own property line because I had discovered contamination risk on a pipe that appeared nowhere in the county's official records. Grant asked both of us to produce documentation, and I handed him everything I had brought with me that morning: my deed, the original well permit, the county boundary survey, and the written notice I had sent the association 10 days earlier. Marla produced a laminated map with an official-looking seal titled Silver Crest Water Authority, showing the pipeline and my valve as property of the association. She stated flatly that I had sabotaged critical infrastructure that belonged to the community she had served faithfully for 3 terms as president. I noticed the problem with that map immediately, and I said so out loud, calmly, without raising my voice. Silvercrest Estates had never operated its own water authority. Every home in that development ran on municipal water service, the same utility that served half the county. Whatever agency Marla's map claimed to represent simply did not exist anywhere in public record, which meant the document in Grant's hands had been fabricated from nothing. Marla cut me off before I could finish, telling Grant I had clearly spent my morning searching the internet, trying to sound like an authority I was not. I told Grant, calmly, that I had spent 14 years as a licensed water systems engineer before returning home to run this ranch, and that I understood pressure systems, backflow prevention, and municipal water law better than most people ever would. For just a moment, something flickered across Marla's face, a flash of uncertainty she covered quickly by insisting my old credentials gave me no authority whatsoever to act against her association. Grant radioed the municipal utility directly and confirmed, within minutes, that not a single household in Silvercrest Estates had reported any loss of drinking water that morning. Only the clubhouse fountain, the decorative lake, and the community pool had lost pressure, exactly matching what I had told him from the start. That confirmation directly contradicted everything Marla had told the emergency dispatcher less than half an hour earlier, and Grant's expression shifted as he processed the gap between her story and the facts on the ground. Marla changed her story on the spot, claiming instead that I might be planning to contaminate the residential water supply later, as though shifting the accusation forward in time could erase the lie she had already told. Because the property dispute remained unresolved and tempers were running high, Grant asked me to step back from the access pit while officers assessed the scene. Marla immediately demanded he arrest me for property destruction, her voice rising in a way that made several onlookers exchange uneasy glances. Grant kept a firm hand near my arm as a precaution, though I never resisted, standing quietly while the truth waited patiently in the folder under my arm. That was when a county vehicle pulled up behind the patrol cars, and Tessa Langford stepped out carrying a thick binder of official pipeline records. She explained to Grant that she had a scheduled inspection appointment with me that very morning, evidence that nothing about my actions had been impulsive or reckless. Marla's face tightened at the sight of an official inspector arriving with paperwork of her own, and I felt, for the first time that morning, the balance of the scene begin to shift. Tessa moved methodically through the access pit, checking the valve, the pump serial numbers, and every connection point along the line, while Grant and Marla stood watching. She confirmed within minutes that the well belonged entirely to Red Hollow Ranch, that my valve sat more than 30 feet inside my own boundary, and that no permit of any kind existed authorizing the Homeowners Association to draw water from my property. She added, almost as an afterthought, that the unpermitted crossing pipe had never been inspected or approved by the county at any point in its existence. Grant released his hold on my arm and redirected the entire focus of the investigation toward the illegal system rather than toward me. Marla insisted, growing more agitated, that my father had granted the association permanent rights to the water decades ago. I produced a copy of the original agreement right there on the hood of the patrol car, showing clearly that it permitted only a single temporary fire hydrant connection during construction, nothing more, and that it had expired 8 full years earlier with no renewal on file anywhere. Marla claimed there was a newer, updated version of that agreement somewhere in the association's files. When Grant asked her to produce it on the spot, she had nothing to show him, only a growing frustration she could not quite hide behind her composure. Tessa, meanwhile, had traced a second, noticeably newer branch splitting off from the main illegal line, and she followed it with her eyes toward the private road leading directly to Marla's own house. Marla's composure cracked for the first time that morning, and she demanded Tessa stop her inspection immediately, insisting she was standing on association property. Tessa looked down at the ground beneath her boots and told Marla, without a trace of anger, that every single person standing in that pit was still standing on Nolan Rourke's land. In the tension of that moment, Marla said something she would spend the rest of the day trying to unsay. She told Tessa I had no right to shut off a line she had personally paid to have installed, and the words left her mouth before she fully understood what she had just admitted in front of 2 officials and a running camera. Grant's body camera had captured every word of it, time-stamped and unbroken, and I watched his expression change as he realized exactly what he now held in evidence. Tessa ordered the illegal system isolated immediately and called in a county crew to excavate the newer branch line for a closer look. That branch did not stop at the clubhouse at all. It continued underground, crossing beneath the association's private road, running directly toward the property Marla called home. What the crew found there confirmed everything I had already suspected from 2 weeks of quiet monitoring. Water from my well was feeding a sprawling lawn around Marla's house, an ornamental koi pond, and a private greenhouse full of imported flowers that had no business surviving in this climate without constant irrigation. Her municipal water meter, when Tessa pulled the records, showed usage far below what a property of that size should have consumed, while my own pump had logged thousands of extra operating hours over the years to cover the difference. I calculated, standing right there in the mud, that hundreds of thousands of dollars in water and electricity had quietly been stolen from this ranch over time. Marla tried to explain it away as a privilege of her office, insisting she needed a home that properly represented the community she led. Grant told her plainly that no elected position on a homeowners board gave her the authority to use another person's private property without consent or compensation. Word had already started spreading among the residents gathered along the fence line, and a few of them exchanged uneasy glances, because many of them remembered paying a special assessment fee for what Marla had called a water conservation upgrade project the previous year. It was becoming clear, even to people who had trusted her for years, that money collected in the name of conservation had instead helped fund a private supply she never had to pay for herself. I handed Tessa 2 full weeks of flow data from my monitoring system, and the numbers told an unmistakable story, spiking every single time irrigation activated at Marla's own address. Marla spun toward me and accused me of illegal surveillance, her voice rising sharply. But Claire Danner had arrived by then and confirmed calmly that every camera and every sensor on that property sat entirely within my own boundary lines. Claire warned Marla, in the same clipped, professional tone she used for everything, not to touch a single piece of equipment on that property. I released the footage of Marla directing her contractor to tamper with my flow meter, and Grant's investigation shifted in that instant from a simple civil property dispute into something that now carried the weight of theft of services and evidence tampering. Cornered, Marla pivoted fast, insisting that every invoice tied to the illegal system had been approved and signed off by the association treasurer, a quiet man named Mitchell Sloan, as if shifting blame downward could somehow undo what her own mouth had already confirmed. Claire immediately sent a formal legal notice demanding the association preserve every relevant email, invoice, and meeting record connected to the water system and its funding. Marla responded within hours by scheduling an emergency closed session, clearly hoping to align the entire board's story before anyone outside the room could compare notes. Her plan, from what later emerged, was to claim the illegal pipeline had been installed decades earlier by the original developer, and that no one currently serving on the board had any knowledge of its existence. Mitchell Sloan realized quickly that Marla intended to let the blame land squarely on him rather than accept any responsibility herself. He reached out quietly to Claire and me 2 days later, choosing to protect himself rather than continue protecting a woman who had already decided he was expendable. What he brought with him changed the entire shape of the case. He handed over emails in which Marla explicitly instructed him to keep the free water source hidden from the general membership, invoices for the private branch line running to her greenhouse, text messages ordering the removal of my flow meter, and a fabricated board resolution claiming the association had formally purchased water rights from Red Hollow Ranch. My signature appeared on that fabricated resolution, and it was not my signature at all. Someone had forged it carefully enough to fool a casual glance, though not carefully enough to survive comparison against my actual notarized documents, the pen strokes too smooth, too hurried, missing the small hitch I always leave in the tail of the final letter of my last name. Claire ran it past a document examiner within a day, and the answer came back exactly as expected. A forgery produced from a scanned signature lifted off some old piece of correspondence I had once sent the board. Mitchell would not say outright who had asked him to keep quiet about the forged resolution, but he did not need to. He told us he had spent 3 sleepless nights deciding whether loyalty to a woman who had never once thanked him was worth more than his own name staying clean, and in the end it was not close. Mitchell's records also revealed that association funds had been used to help finance construction of the private branch line running to Marla's home, disguised in the books as general landscaping maintenance. Residents, according to those same records, had collectively paid $214,000 into what Marla called a water protection fund, and a portion of that money had gone directly toward building her koi pond and her private greenhouse. I did not release any of this publicly right away. Claire suggested a more patient approach, letting Marla continue telling her version of events at the upcoming board meeting, then dismantling each claim in front of the very residents she had spent years trying to control. In the meantime, I received a formal letter from the association demanding that I reopen the valve immediately, issue a public apology for what they called reckless behavior, and pay $50,000 in damages for harm done to community landscaping. The letter even threatened to place a lien against Red Hollow Ranch, despite the fact that the association had never held any legal authority over my land in the first place. My response to that letter was short. I wrote back a single line, telling them to present all of their evidence at the emergency meeting scheduled for Thursday night, and that I would be there to answer for myself in person. Word came back to me through a neighbor that Marla had already told several residents the police would be present at that meeting specifically to arrest me once she finished laying out her case. She seemed entirely confident that the story she had built would hold, unaware that every thread of it was about to come apart in front of the same audience she had spent years cultivating. The clubhouse meeting room was packed that Thursday night, every folding chair filled and people standing along the back wall. Marla sat at the center of a long table at the front, papers arranged neatly in front of her, already rehearsing in her mind the version of events that painted me as a bitter, resentful man who envied the wealth of Silvercrest Estates. She told the room I had attempted to extort the association by shutting off shared water, holding an entire community hostage over money. I sat quietly near the back beside Claire and Tessa, letting her finish every word of it before we said a single thing in response. Grant Hollis stood near the side door, present but silent, giving no indication of which side of the room he had come for. Marla projected her fabricated map onto the screen behind her, the same one bearing the name Silver Crest Water Authority, and Claire waited until she had finished before speaking for the first time that evening. Claire asked Marla, in front of the entire room, to confirm 3 simple things under her own signature and reputation: that the map was accurate, that the association legally owned the pipeline in question, and that no branch of that system led to any private residence. Marla, confident and unwavering, confirmed all 3 claims without hesitation, exactly as Claire had hoped she would. She even added, glancing toward the crowd for effect, that she found it almost sad how far a man would go to distract from his own reckless behavior, and a few scattered voices in the room murmured in agreement before they understood what was actually happening. She had built her entire career in that community on this exact rhythm, a confident claim followed by a practiced pause, daring anyone to challenge her in public. This time the pause lasted only a few seconds, before Claire began taking that confidence apart, piece by piece, using nothing but the woman's own words against her. I stood and walked to the front of the room, laying out the county boundary survey, the original well permit, the expired temporary use agreement, and Tessa's official inspection report, one document at a time. Tessa followed by explaining to the room, plainly and without embellishment, that Marla's map used a government seal that did not correspond to any real agency, and referenced an authority that had never existed anywhere in county or state records. Marla accused me on the spot of forging documents to make myself look innocent, her voice climbing toward panic as she felt the room's attention shifting away from her. Claire played the footage next, the one showing Marla directing her contractor to remove my equipment under cover of darkness, followed by the excavation photos revealing the branch line running straight to her own property. The mood in that room changed completely within seconds. Residents who had defended Marla for years now openly demanded she explain exactly what had happened to the $214,000 they had personally paid into her so-called Water Protection Fund. Marla turned on Mitchell Sloan in front of everyone, insisting he had acted entirely on his own without her knowledge or approval. Mitchell stood up slowly, set a thick folder of printed emails on the table in front of the entire board, and told the room, in a voice far steadier than I expected from him, that every instruction he had ever followed came directly from Marla herself. He began reading portions of those emails aloud, each one detailing her explicit orders to keep the free water source hidden from the general membership at all costs. One email in particular stopped the room cold, stating plainly that if I ever discovered what had been happening, the association would apply enough legal pressure to force me into selling the ranch entirely. Marla's composure finally shattered completely, and she turned her frustration back on me, insisting a man who spent his life around cattle could never outmaneuver an entire board of educated professionals. I told the room, calmly, about my 14 years designing and auditing municipal water infrastructure, and I watched something shift in Marla's expression as she realized, far too late, that she had misjudged me from the very first day we met. Grant stepped forward then and played the recording of her original 911 call for everyone present, her voice claiming residents had lost drinking water, that I was threatening to poison the supply, that I was armed and dangerous. Every single claim in that recording was false, and every person in that room now understood it. His body camera footage from that first morning followed immediately after, capturing Marla's own admission that she had personally paid for the illegal line, a statement that directly contradicted every word she had just told this room. A representative from the association's insurance carrier, who had been quietly listening from the back since the accusations against Mitchell began, informed the board that intentional and fraudulent conduct by an officer would likely fall outside any coverage the policy provided. That meant, in plain terms, that Marla herself could be held personally liable for every dollar of damages this situation had caused, with her own assets on the line, rather than the community's insurance. The board called for an emergency vote right there in the room, and Marla was suspended from the presidency before the meeting even reached its scheduled end. Even then, some part of her still believed I was the one who would end up in handcuffs, and she turned toward Grant and ordered him to do his job. Grant walked forward, but instead of turning toward me the way she expected, he asked Marla to place both of her hands flat on the table in front of her. He informed her calmly that she was now under investigation for filing a false emergency report, theft of services, tampering with private property and evidence, forging official documents, and misappropriating association funds for personal use. The arrest itself was quiet, almost anticlimactic after everything that had led up to it, with no struggle and no raised voices beyond Marla's own protests. She tried, right up until the moment they walked her out, to order board members to intervene on her behalf, but not a single person in that room moved to stop it. As deputies escorted her toward the door, she called out that I had destroyed this community, and I answered her simply, without raising my voice, that she was the one who had turned this community into a shield for everything she had been hiding. County officials sealed the illegal pipeline system within days of that meeting, and not a single household ever lost access to drinking water throughout the entire ordeal, because every home had remained connected to the municipal supply the whole time. Only the fountain, the decorative lake, the greenhouse, and the ornamental landscaping had ever gone dry, exactly as I had told Grant on that very first morning. The subsequent investigation confirmed that the association had been illegally drawing water from Red Hollow Ranch for more than 8 years, ever since the original temporary agreement quietly expired, without anyone bothering to remove the tap. The total damages included years of electricity spent running my pump overtime, accelerated wear on equipment never designed for that kind of continuous load, the market value of the stolen water itself, remediation costs tied to the contamination risk near my well, and legal fees for both restoring the land and pursuing the case. Marla resigned from every position on the board before the civil case could even reach a courtroom, but resignation did nothing to shield her from personal responsibility for what she had done. A lien was placed against her own house to secure the damages owed, the exact legal tool she had once threatened to use against my ranch, now turned squarely back against her. There was a certain quiet irony in that outcome that I did not need to point out to anyone, because everyone in that community understood it without a single word from me. I still had a decision left to make once the dust settled, whether to pursue the entire association for every dollar available or focus responsibility on the people who had actually orchestrated the deception. I thought about the families in Silver Crest Estates who had never known anything about the stolen water, people who had simply paid their dues and trusted the woman running their meetings. Punishing them for Marla's choices would not have made anything right, and it would have made me no better than the person who had tried to weaponize an entire community against a man who had done nothing but protect his own land. So I agreed to a resolution that felt fair rather than vindictive. The association's legitimate insurance fund covered a portion of the damages, while Marla and the individuals directly involved in the fraud bore personal responsibility for the rest, including full payment of my legal fees. Every illegal pipe crossing my property line had to be physically removed at the association's expense, and the boundary of Red Hollow Ranch was formally re-recorded with the county to prevent any future confusion about where my land began. The board issued a written public retraction of every accusation ever made against me, filed permanently in the association's own records for anyone to read. Silver Crest Estates connected its landscaping and irrigation to a properly permitted municipal line, the kind of legitimate system it should have had from the very beginning. To cut down on ongoing costs, The new board replaced the artificial lake with drought-tolerant native plantings that required a fraction of the water the old landscaping had demanded. Marla's house went up for sale not long after, once it became clear she could not cover what she now owed. The greenhouse and koi pond, sitting empty behind a property she could no longer afford to keep. I used a portion of the settlement to replace my well pump entirely and install a modern monitoring system, one that would catch anything unusual on this land far sooner than I had caught this. One quiet morning, weeks after everything had finally settled, I walked back out to the access pit where all of this had started. I opened the valve myself, slow and deliberate, and listened as water began flowing again toward the troughs scattered across my pasture. On the other side of the fence, the Silver Crest fountain stayed exactly as silent as it had been the day I first shut off that line, and this time it stayed that way because nobody needed to steal from me to fill it. I did not feel any particular satisfaction in knowing Marla had been arrested, because that part of the story had never been the point for me. What settled things in my mind was simpler than that. The knowledge that she no longer held the power to turn her own lies into someone else's punishment. I thought, standing there with my hand still resting on the valve, about the way she used to laugh whenever I tried to explain how the water system actually worked, certain that a rancher like me could never understand a map. It was that very same map, along with a flow meter she once called a toy and a 911 call she made to protect herself, that ended up unraveling every lie she had built her reputation on. There is a particular kind of person who mistakes quiet for weakness, who assumes that a man in work boots and a faded shirt has nothing worth listening to. And Marla Whitcomb had built her entire sense of authority on exactly that assumption. She never once considered that the same patience she mocked in me was the very thing that would eventually undo her. I still run Red Hollow Ranch the way my grandfather did, checking fence lines at dawn and walking the pastures before the sun gets high, and most mornings I hardly think about that valve at all anymore. But every so often, when I pass the access pit on my way to the eastern trough, I remember the exact sound of 3 patrol cars pulling up my gravel drive, lights flashing across land that had belonged to my family for 70 years before anyone ever heard the name Silver Crest. Marla called the police that morning to prove the water belonged to her. In the end, that recording became the clearest proof of all that nothing she had claimed was ever true.